everybody. It is a beautiful, bright, cold day. We finally have good weather for the summit, so I'm glad to see you all here today. So thank you very much for coming to our 10th annual On-Farm Research Summit. So my name is Melissa Carlson, and I'm the VP of Research for Minnesota Wheat and an On-Farm Research Coordinator for our On-Farm Research Network. I've got a lot of familiar faces here. I see a lot of familiar faces here, but just for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the On-Farm Research Network, this is funded in part by the Minnesota Wheat and your checkoff dollars. So about 50% of your checkoff dollars go specifically towards wheat research. And so we fund university projects with that money, and we also partially fund the On-Farm Research Network. And so that's where the bulk of our money comes from. And then we also work with the Minnesota Soybean Research Council. And David Key is here today also from Minnesota Soybean. They have funded some grants with us to allow us to be able to work on wheat and soybeans. And then also we work with AFREC, the Agricultural Fertilizer Research and Education Council. So that is your fertilizer checkoff. And we also have worked with the MDA in the past. They've funded some grants for our on-farm program as well. And I never get to this slide at the end, so I put it at the beginning this time. I just wanted to thank all of our cooperators, the crop advisors that we work with, Magnuson Research Farm and Silver Oak Growers, and all the co-ops that we work with. There's a lot of names and logos up there. It takes a lot of people to gather all this information and get these trials in and in front of you for you to learn about what we're doing out in the field. So I just wanted to thank everybody for all the work that they do to help this research happen. And so a little bit going back to what our on-farm network is, if you're not familiar, if you haven't done a plot with us before, it's a little bit different from small plot research. So university research, they're doing small plots, usually on the research station, or maybe if you've hosted a research plot out in your field before, you've got a bunch of usually like 5x10 plots out in the field. So that's great for doing a lot of the kind of initial research and getting a lot of treatments out there to see what works and what doesn't. And then in the on-farm research, we take that and we scale it up to field scale. So we are using your combine, your sprayer, your spreader, the co-op spreader, to go out and apply these in field conditions like what you would see out in your field. So they both kind of basically we're taking the small plot research and scaling it up to field scale, so they really complement each other. And so we're gonna have a little bit of survey and interactive texting in today. So I wanted to do an easy question to get you guys entered and started in. So the conference code for you guys to text in is also at the bottom of your programs. If you can see the code there. So text in PG-Conf 644 to 22333, just to do a quick little survey from you guys to answer the question, for you guys or for your operation, has your farm intentionally tested one farming practice against another in the field? Either are you doing this every year, it's something you guys are really adamant about doing, it's maybe something you've tried a few times, or maybe you guys have never tried it before. And I'm talking any kind of test, not specifically there are replicated trials, maybe you split a field or you put a strip out just to see if some product or some practice would work better than another. And I had a pretty good feeling that A would probably be pretty high. I believe in you guys, that you guys are out there testing new things. I'm glad to see that we have C is a little bit lower, but maybe there's a couple people out there who've never tried something before. And so if you guys have only tried something maybe one or two times out in the field, or you've never tried testing one product against the other, I guess maybe take a listen today and see if there's anything that interests you. Whether you do a full-scale trial like what we do, or if you're just even start by splitting a field or putting a strip out there, just doing anything you can to try testing something new. It's definitely going to help you move your operation forward. All right, so I think we'll leave that with that. But thank you guys for texting in. Kind of a fun little tool we get to play with. So our on-farm trials are replicated and randomized. And so that's where we gain a little bit more statistical power in what we're doing. So instead of just splitting a field, which it can give you kind of an idea, some observations, kind of give you a, maybe this worked, maybe it didn't, but it's really hard to say if one side of the field did better because the treatment actually worked, or if just because that side of the field happened to yield better for the year. So what we do is we randomize and we replicate each of our treatments out in the field to make sure that we can get a true test of whether or not a practice is actually working. And then where the large plot power really comes into play is when we repeat this at multiple locations each year, and then we repeat it in multiple years over multiple growing seasons. And that's where we're able to really draw a little bit more power with our data, as having multiple years, multiple locations. And so this year, in 2022, we got some new trials that we got started this year. So a lot of our data from this year is first year data. Did a little switch up from what we've been looking at in the past. And so we'll be talking about foliar copper applications that we tried this year. We took a look at polyhalite, which if you haven't heard of that before, I'll explain it a little bit when we get to there. Let's see. I think that slide is actually incorrect. We'll not be doing on nitrogen stabilizers, but we'll be looking at elevated P and K applications, nitrogen rates, not nitrogen stabilizers. And then we'll actually be looking at nitrogen rates and going through some results we had from last year. I apologize for that. I think the wrong slide got stuck in there. But you guys have the agenda in front of you, so you can see what we're going through today. So we'll get started with foliar copper applications. So this project came up, some consultants and farmers in the area had noticed that they were seeing copper deficiencies in wheat on mineral soils. It's kind of common practice to apply copper in peat soils, since the copper is very easily tied up into the organic matter on peat soils, but they've been noticing it on mineral soils, especially ones that are testing low in copper, so maybe those sandy or low organic matter ridges. And so we decided to do a little bit of testing to see if copper applications could help with our wheat yields. And so originally we wanted to try copper sulfate. Granley earlier applied to, spread in the spring, but we weren't really able to get a good source of copper sulfate for this trial. So our backup was to use a foliar liquid application. And so we were able to get the product Elemax donated. Not endorsing the product by any means, that's the one we were able to use and get donated for this trial. And so we applied it at the label rate at tillering. And we did this on soils that were testing low in copper, so kind of a threshold for copper soil test levels. You want to apply, you'll have a better probability of response when you apply at less than 0.4 parts per million copper. So those were the fields that we shot for. And we ended up with 2 locations this year. We originally had about 8 locations lined up, but as you guys well know, this spring got pretty crazy. And so we lost a couple locations just from farmers having the fields were prevent plant, or they had to rotate out of wheat, stuff like that. So we did end up with 2 locations that we were able to take through to harvest. One in Roosevelt, way up north, and then one over towards Beltrami, which is east of Crookston. And so what I wanted to point out here, you can see both of our soil test levels in these fields were less than 0.4 parts per million. So they're lower testing soils. And you guys, if you want to follow along in the book, this is on page 4. I've also got the page numbers on the slides there if you want to look at the extra information that's there. I've just kind of got abbreviated tables on the slides. And one thing I just wanted to note that for these sites, the Roosevelt location got a lot less rain than the Beltrami did, and I think that might have played into some of the yield results that we saw. And so this year, when looking at least for yield, so the Beltrami location actually yielded almost about 4 bushels better with the copper application. And I know the crop consultant that we were working with on that field, he's been seeing copper deficiencies in a lot of his fields, a lot of his growers. And so that was kind of interesting, maybe encouraging to see that one. In Roosevelt, we did not see a significant difference, but that site also had a little less lower rain. And so I'm kind of just thinking, maybe maybe there was copper deficiency out there, but if rain was your limiting factor, then the copper application really doesn't matter. So that's kind of what I've got to say about these trials for this year. I don't know if, so Chris had taken taking care of the Roosevelt. He was in charge of that location. Chris, I don't know if you have any comments from anything that you saw working with that field up in the north.
All I'd have to say is, yeah, I agree with Missy. Rain, they just didn't get it. I think that really affected the field itself. I mean, I'd like to do another trial up there. Looking back there, my guy. So, and just to try it out again, and hopefully we get a little better situation and circumstances. Late planting, it was pretty late, planted pretty late in the year. Yeah, what he said is the field we had available wasn't very large by any means. So what he's thinking is that potentially if we had more space, a larger testing area, we might have saw some more differences.
So unfortunately, I wish I had more location data to share with you guys, but we just had the 2 for this year. So we will be repeating this trial definitely again next year. So if this is something that you guys are interested in trying out, we still have more product to test this again next year. And so we'll be looking forward to testing this out some more, seeing what results we're getting. And then I think next year, and I know some of you are probably wondering about tissue testing. We did not do tissue testing this year, but that is something we are going to add in next year also. Question? Yes. Okay, so the question, he was just wondering if we applied it separately or with the herbicide application. And I do have that I do have that in your methods there. So you are, on the label, you can apply it, I believe, with herbicides, but for our testing, we applied it alone. Without the herbicides, so we wouldn't have any confounding factors there. Right. More questions? All right, one more question.
Melissa, is there any corresponding on this compared to like a granular? I remember seeing some studies done in the 90s on some copper that was just sulfate for minor nutrients put in with the phosphate fertilizer blend. I was just wondering if that would correlate or anything. I mean, looking for the yields. I mean, wondering why at this time instead.
Okay, so your question, you're wondering, why foliar versus copper sulfate, if that's the better. And I think I briefly mentioned it, but I believe copper sulfate is the preferred way to apply copper or correct deficiencies. And John Brecker, I see him back there, can always correct me if I'm wrong. So we do have the AgVise rep in the room. But copper sulfate is the preferred way, but we just weren't able to get a good source of it for doing our on-farm testing. So I think if you wanted to do it on your field, if you had some copper fields that were low testing in copper, copper sulfate spread in the fertilizer would definitely be a good option. But the liquid, the chelate foliar option is also just another option for correcting deficiencies out in the field, or if you can't get a hold of the granular fertilizer. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay.
Missy.
Yes.
Another thing with the copper sulfate is more of a long-term fix, a maintenance fix, where the chelate is we got to do something. So this is what we can do right here, right now, rather than maintaining your copper levels at a higher level, basically.
All right. And if you guys have any more questions, definitely catch us at the break. Always touch base more on it there, but we'll move on to polyhalite here to keep rolling. So this new test that we did is actually looking at polyhalite, comparing it to ammonium sulfate. So what I ask is polyhalite. So polyhalite is a mineral. It's mined in the UK. It's not synthesized, so it also qualifies for organic if that's of interest to you. So it has potassium, sulfur, and then magnesium and calcium in it. So you can use it as a source of potassium or sulfur. Magnesium, calcium too, but I don't think most of us are not too concerned about magnesium and calcium in our parts of the world. So we decided to focus really on the sulfur portion of it for this test. And so basically we were just trying to determine if polyhalite was a viable alternative to AMS, which is what the majority of you, or MES. We were also open to testing with MES, but we just did AMS for this year. Just to see if it's a viable alternative, something, another tool in the toolbox. And so what we did, we just compared equal rates of each, just changing up the source of sulfur. So our control treatment was the grower's NPK rate with 10 units of sulfur as AMS, and then the treatment was the grower's NPK rate with 10 units of sulfur coming from the polyhalite, and then balancing those out for nitrogen and potassium. And so kind of what we saw, we didn't really see any yield differences between the polyhalite, and that's really what we were looking for. I guess what we want to see, I guess with this treatment, is either the polyhalite being equal or better than AMS or MES. And so we didn't really see any differences, any significant differences in our 4 locations that we had this year. So we were in Mentor, we had 2 that were near Red Lake Falls, and then 1 near Stephen. The Stephen location had a significant difference in protein. The AMS was a little bit higher by 0.3. But again, that's just one site, 1 year so far. The interesting thing that we did notice, I didn't have it highlighted in this table, but you guys can see it in your tables also on page 7, is we ended up with some pretty crazy residual sulfur levels, especially in the 6 to 24 inch depth. At least crazy, and I haven't seen on our soil tests it being that high. I don't know if maybe you guys have seen stuff like that before. Just ending up, 100 to almost 300 pounds of sulfur. I mean, that was consistent across all of our soil tests. We have 1 soil test in each plot. So we had 8 different soil tests, and we're all testing really high. I had 2 hypotheses for that. Either the wet spring, we mineralized this excessive amount of sulfur from the organic matter in this wet spring that we had, or I guess Dave Franzen always says that he doesn't put much stock in the sulfur test. It can throw some crazy results. I guess it could be either. My gut would maybe be the latter, but I guess I don't really have a good explanation for those results that we got. So at least the key takeaways from this year, 4 sites, 1 year, no significant differences in yield between the 2 treatments, and just some crazy sulfur tests at the end. So that's kind of what we have so far for this year. We will be repeating this trial again next year. So let me know, reach out to me if it's something you're interested in trying on your farm. Yes, so polyhalite, that's a very important point. Polyhalite, the company that we were working with, it is not commercially available yet, and so part of the reason why the company is doing a bunch of testing is to figure out what they're going to price it at. So that's why I don't have any money numbers to stick in front of you guys, because they don't have a price for polyhalite yet. All right. Just to keep rolling on from there. If you guys don't have any more questions with that, we'll switch into a project that we've been doing over the last 4 years. This is usually where I switch it to Dr. Dave Grafstrom, who's the research agronomist at the Magnuson Research Farm up in Roseau. He's kind of been the lead PI on this part, but he is sick today, unfortunately, so I'm going to try and present on some of his plots from the small plot data and give you guys what we have from the large plots also. So this was a tougher year for our P&K trial. But just to kind of refresh you guys, and if you haven't heard of what we're doing with this one yet, so originally back in 2019 we started this trial to determine optimum levels of potassium and phosphorus in soybean and wheat rotations. And the idea with this is that we would apply extra P&K over the long term. So in the same plots, we got an extra 50 units each of P&K in the same plots over 4 years in a wheat and soybean rotation. And so following the soil and tissue samples in those plots over the 4 years, also to trying to see if we can see if maybe the wheat or the soybeans is maybe taking up more than we think they are, if there's any luxury consumption going on, just trying to track to make sure that we're not shorting ourselves on P&K. And so we did this with Dave Grafstrom, so this was kind of a small plot, large plot trial, which kind of combines the best of both worlds. So Dave was able to, in his small plots, test all different levels of P alone, of K alone, and then of P and K in combination. And then in the on-farm plots, we were just testing one treatment of the extra 50 units P and K compared to what the farmer was spreading. So there you guys have all the different small plot treatments that you guys can see those in your book. And so this is where I'm going to try and talk about Dave's small plot research. Hopefully I do him justice. He will also be presenting at the soybean research reporting session tomorrow. He'll be in the room just on the other side of this barrier here. And he will be able to give you guys the full update of what's going on there. So there's two different small plot sites, one in wheat and one in soybeans on the research farm. And in 2022, he found that there's no differences in yield or quality among any of the treatments, control, zero fertilizer applied, compared to all the extra fertilizer applied and everything in between. So no fun interactions to talk about with you guys there. But he did notice he saw some potassium and phosphorus deficiencies showing up in the leaves and the pods, particularly in the control treatments that hadn't received fertilizer over the last 4 years. So it isn't very surprising. And then some aphid issues that he also noticed. Here's the small plot data. These are also in your books, and I'm not going to try and go through all of that giant table here. You guys will have to catch Dave tomorrow to hear him go through all of that. But he did have just some interesting pictures to look at with the potassium deficiency and the phosphorus deficiency that was showing up. And then one thing he did notice that he wanted to share, they had aphid problems in the plots, but mostly in the potassium deficient soybeans. So I think conventional, there tends to be two schools of thought, I think, when it comes to where the bugs go. There's kind of just what you're kind of taught in school. The bugs usually go for the healthiest plants, green plants, getting a lot of nutrition there. And then there's also kind of another school of thought with insects being decomposers and going for the deficient diseased or deficient plants first. And so what Dave saw was actually that the sick plants, the deficient plants, were actually the ones being attacked by the aphids, and the healthy plants were actually okay. So that was kind of just neat to see this year. So yeah, just to summarize what Dave kind of summarized from this year, and his short little summary so far from 2019 through 2022. Wheat definitely responded positively to P and the combination of P and K during the 4 years. Soybeans was also responding positively to phosphorus. We kind of thought that phosphorus would be the bigger player compared to potassium. And then he also kind of was tracking the residual soil tests each year, and kind of as you would assume, soil being depleted with lack of fertilizer being applied. That's kind of my summary from Dave's slides. I'm probably not doing him justice, but a little bit of what we've seen in small plots. Dave is still working on getting all of the data together, both from this year and then compiling. I guess we're both working on getting all of the data from both this year and compiling it into one giant final report. Unfortunately, I wish we had that to share with you guys this year, but it's just not ready yet. So I think we can get it in by small grains updates meetings. We'll update you guys later in other winter meetings this year, but otherwise I think we'll do more of a overall 4-year compilation summary at our next summit next year. Have everything ready for you. Just to touch on the large plot yield, so this trial, originally we had 5 sites that we were trying to track over the 4 years. And unfortunately, as you guys can see, we only had 2 this year. So 3 this last final year we lost to prevent plant, or I think just to prevent plant or not being able to harvest, which was really unfortunate, but it's just kind of the way it went this year. So we do have the results from Baudette and Elbow Lake. Baudette was soybeans this year. See all of the information, extra information on page 12 in your books there. Didn't see any differences in yield. It was a little moisture, I think, during the growing season, so it wasn't the highest yielding year. So not creating a super high yielding environment where the extra P and K fertility might have been needed. But in Elbow Lake, they had a fantastic wheat year in Elbow Lake. So it was really high yielding environment, really pushed the yields this year. And so I think having the conditions conducive for really getting those high yields, having the extra P and K out there did actually help boost yield this year. That being said, even though we saw almost a 4 bushel increase, even just this year, when you calculate out the fertilizer prices and doing the cost of doing that extra fertilizer, it really didn't pay for itself. So we did raise yield, but it wasn't a profitable yield. I would not say that it would be worth pouring on the extra fertilizer there, at least not to the levels that we were looking at. As I mentioned before, we will have a more full, complete look at the data for you guys coming in future meetings. It's just kind of a rush, especially when harvest is a month late, it pushes everything back. So it's just been a rush to get everything together in time for you guys. So if are there any quick questions, or we'll move on to the next one? All right, with that, so this is, we'll move on to nitrogen rates. And our idea with this one is really over the course of the next several years to collect a lot of different locations so that we can start trying to look at the interaction between nitrogen rate and variety. Is our main goal with this project. So we want to look at yield and protein, and then also profitability of pushing these nitrogen rates on both modern high-yielding varieties that you guys are using right now, and then we'd also like to look at kind of more of the lower-yielding, high-quality standbys that a lot of folks are also planting. And so really as an example, our 2 main target varieties that I'd like to see a lot of data on would be looking at kind of comparing 9590 and then also kind of the 9590s, that racehorse variety, pouring coals to it and seeing how far it can go, and then comparing it to Linkert, which is a good high quality kind of standby, but maybe it doesn't require as much management. Or maybe I should say generally doesn't get the management that maybe something like 9590 would get. All right, we got a question quick. If for data that we're collecting, looking at falling numbers in the grain when we're looking at pushing the nitrogen, are we also increasing our falling numbers? And that's something I can touch on also when we get to the data too. But as far as looking at quality analysis, and I was approached by National Wheat Foundation too about doing baking quality tests on these. The struggle with our data collection in this trial, which I'll get to, is having enough grain to do those tests. Falling numbers we would be able to do, but the baking quality tests a little bit more difficult. And so we changed up. We finally, after 10 years, are diving into prescription map-based trials. So this is new this year for how we're doing trials. So if you've done them with us before, you know that we do the big strips out in the field. We harvest them with the combine, just taking a full pass down the strip, down the whole length of the field, and then we dump it in the weigh wagon and grab our protein sample that way. So this way, doing it this way, we had 6 nitrogen rates. So we have 6 treatments and 3 replications. It's just not enough room in the field. And you guys probably at harvest don't want to be harvesting 18 giant plots. So we went to a map-based trial, which maybe is a little difficult to see on the screen there, but the pictures are also in the book on page 14. You can see it a little bit better. So that first plot that we have there would be map A in your book, is a map layout of our 6 nitrogen rates. We have, and these are all in units of nitrogen applied. Everything was applied as urea for this year, although looking at anhydrous also next year. So we had 0, 60, 90, 120, 150, and 180 units of total applied nitrogen. And so we had 6 treatments replicated in 3 blocks out in the field. So each of those blocks are 140 feet. So that's one round of the spreader wide and about 400 feet long. And so what I did is I just kind of overlaid that. I embedded it in a prescription map and loaded it into the spreader. And so the spreader did all the work. And so this is actually our East Grand Forks site that we have here. So you can see the map layout and then the actual prescription map there on the right. And so the spreader did all the work, and so we get this nice application map afterwards that we're able to use for doing the data collection. So I can verify that the treatments went on the way that they were supposed to go on. And then so when it came to harvest, instead of using the weigh wagon, which we usually do, we calibrated, made sure the growers calibrated their yield monitors, and then they were just able to harvest the field normally. So there was no interference with harvesting. And so then afterwards, I was able to get the yield map and extract the yield data out of the plots, and then look at yield and harvest moisture that way. And so that is how we did this project. But you will say, what about the protein? So how we got the protein. Actually, I had to go and hand sample. So our wheat staff this year, so we only had two sites this year, so it wasn't too bad. But about a week before harvest, as the wheat was drying, just about dried down, we went out and hand collected all of the wheat samples. So you can see a picture of me there with kind of the hand sickle, and so we're just walking across the whole plot, grabbing wheat heads and sticking them in a grocery bag. And so I got about a giant grocery bag full of wheat heads that I then brought over to Crookston, and Mike and the North Farm crew over at Crookston were kind enough to thresh the samples that we grabbed through their small plot combine so that we could get enough grain for measuring protein. So that is how we collected protein for this site. The only other way we would be able to do it would be to have our growers that were working with our protein analyzer, the protein maps, but since none of you guys have protein analyzers, this is how we have to do it for now. And so the yield data was kind of interesting. One site kind of responded how we thought it would, and one site was a little different. And so on page 15, I have the yield, protein, moisture, and then we did residual soil nitrate. So we soil tested each of the plots also. And so looking at East Grand Forks, yield kind of responded as expected. This site had a little bit less rain than the Red Lake Falls site did. So yield respond as we increased nitrogen, we increased yield to a point, although most of the nitrogen treatments were relatively the same, although you did get the 180 units did result in the highest yield, and that was a significant difference. Protein was a little bit different. There's the data there are non-significant, but I can tell, well, and I should have put the chart up here. The protein kind of went up, and then it went down, and then it shot up again, instead of just what I would have expected would be for the protein to be consistently climbing as we increase nitrogen rates. And that was kind of consistent among all the treatments in the plots, is that protein went up and then down and then up again. So that was kind of weird, and I'm not really sure why that happened. And then, so I also calculated a kind of a partial profit just to try and play with some money numbers when we're looking at this data. And so you can kind of see the prices that I used there at the bottom. So basically I used this year's prices, so $8 wheat. So whatever the yield was times $8, and then I counted plus or minus the protein premiums and discounts on the protein content for each plot. And then also taking out the cost of the urea applied. So I did that at $800 a ton. And so what it ended up being, it was kind of really interesting that the 60 units of nitrogen at this site ended up being the most profitable nitrogen rate. And then actually 150 units ended up being the least profitable. And I'm kind of wondering if that was a little bit tied to the premiums and discounts, but the discounts were only about a nickel per fifth either way, about whenever I made this table a month or so ago. So it wasn't huge discounts. That I thought was a little bit interesting to see that maybe, and you guys see that in other nitrogen rate trials too, and other university extension are presenting too. Not every site needs nitrogen every year. I think that was also interesting to see at Red Lake Falls. This site responded a little bit more normally like we would expect, but just looking at that zero rate, I mean, getting 70 bushels off of zero nitrogen, that's pretty good. That's a good year. So this site did receive a little bit more rain than the East Grand Forks site, and so that helped really push the yields this year for them. So this was 90, I forgot to mention the varieties, you guys have it there. This variety in Red Lake Falls was 95.90, and then it was 97.19 at East Grand Forks. I wish Westbred would do names instead of numbers. I like the names. So Red Lake Falls kind of responded as we would normally expect. So increasing nitrogen, increased yield, increased protein, and then the profitability wasn't significantly different, but profitability going up as we pushed that nitrogen. And that was kind of our working hypothesis on the racehorse varieties like 95-90, pushing the nitrogen, really maximizing your yield. So that's kind of what I have to begin this trial. So we just had the 2 sites, and just for this total data, I'm really looking forward to collecting more sites and more data. We're definitely going to be continuing on with this trial, and I'd definitely like to get more varieties in there too. So more sites and more varieties that we're able to collect, then we can start pulling apart those nitrogen rate by variety interactions. And so with that, I'll take any questions that you guys have.
With the higher levels? Yeah, about lodging?
Yep, okay, so question was if we saw differences in lodging, and East Grand Forks site, I don't recall, there wasn't a lot of lodging. The Red Lake Falls site, yes, the higher nitrogen rates, they weren't flat, They weren't on the ground, unless I'm remembering wrong. But they were tipped over a little bit. They were starting, the heads were knotted a little bit more. So if it was a high lodging year, yeah, that definitely maybe could have turned into a problem. All right, so question was about the residual nitrogen from 2021, and so that would be on page 13 in your tables. So we have their East Grand Forks had about 40 pounds, 0 to 12-inch sample residual nitrate, and Red Lake Falls had 36 pounds, 0 to 6-inch was what they took. So not, I wouldn't say excessively high. It's not like they had 100 pounds residual from 2021, if that's kind of to your point. All right, if there are no more questions, if you guys think of something, you can always stop and ask us at the break. Text me or email me, or give me a call. But to keep moving on, be a little bit ahead of time, which I think will be okay. So that kind of concludes the data that I'm going to share for this year. We did do a few other trials, just kind of one-off sites. So we did actually start rock rolling this year. We tried a rock rolling trial. There's a grower that really had a question about it and wanted to start it, so we tried to get a few sites together for it, just rock rolling wheat versus not rock rolling wheat. Long story short, we didn't see any differences, but we will, at least not in the yield, but we will be looking at that one again. Something new that popped up, and then also working on a kind of a long-term cover crop trial that will kind of compile and present the data next year. Some other side trials that we're doing also. But I think, so this year, being that it was our 10th anniversary, thought it was about time that we maybe do a little bit of review of things that we've covered in the past. Especially a lot of years we get a lot of questions, people asking, are you going to look at top dressing? Are you going to look at different nitrogen stuff, or try this or try that? It's like, well, we actually did that a while back. So thought it was a good time to do a little bit of a review and touch on things that we've seen over the last 10 years. And I had to include this picture when I was going through all of our old reports. It's kind of hard to see up there, but you can see there's one of our growers from way back when. I think it was a 2014 picture, probing the hopper. And I think that was actually me up there holding the bucket as he's trying to dump the probe from the hopper. And so I think we've come a long way from those days of trying to probe the hopper in every plot to the way that we had it set up with the grain carts, and then now trying to move into the application map. So moving forward and trying to make some progress. And I won't touch over all of these, but I just kind of wanted to show you guys all the different projects that we've done over the years. We've got a lot of them. Some of them had a lot more locations than others. Some were kind of one-off projects we did. Seeding rate, sulfur, variable rate, nitrogen, flyleaf fungicide was a big one. Top dressing UAN. Also doing a little bit with the soybean research. So we've done quite a number of projects. But the ones that I just want to touch on, at least for our little review this year, be these main ones that were kind of our more focused projects. And so one question, so this is the ESN versus urea question. That was the original protocol that we had back in 2012. There's a lot of I was still in undergrad at that point, so I wasn't in the ag talk, but I know ESN and urea and nitrogen were big topics way back then that growers wanted to know about. So that's kind of how the on-farm network got started, was looking at ESN versus urea. And was there any yield difference? Was there any benefit to it? And so they did trials in 2012, not 2013, but 2014, 15, and 16. And so I was able to grab some of the data from 2016. And fortunately, I have access to the table in Excel, so I couldn't blow it up for you guys. So there's a picture of it there. But basically, long story short, they were looking at 100% of ESN versus 100% of urea applied all pre-plant, and no differences in yield or protein. So there was no real advantage to using ESN versus urea. A lot of the small plot research looked at ESN in combination with urea, and so that is something that we didn't look at. Was trying to maybe do a 75-25 split to see if we can get some extra nitrogen that way. I think one of the reasons that was written up, I didn't write the report, but one of their reasoning was that ESN really shines in very high nitrogen loss environments. And so really we just didn't have a lot of nitrogen loss in those years either. And so it's going to be very specific conditions when paying for that polycoated urea is really going to shine. But I guess that's for you guys to decide and weigh if it's really going to be worth investing in or just taking the hit in whatever odd year it is that when we have a lot of nitrogen loss. So just wanted to reiterate some of our findings from ESN and urea. We also did a lot of work top dressing UAN. That was a question that we looked at from 2016 through 2018. And I know Joel Ransom did a lot of small plot research on this project, and so that's kind of where the on-farm protocols came out of his research at NDSU. And so our large plots, we were looking at 100% pre-plant nitrogen compared to basically a base plus 30 program. So 100% pre-plant plus 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre as UAN at boot stage. Typically, a lot of guys are putting UAN down at tillering, but we were trying, and then you can also make you put it down at tillering to really try and get a yield boost. You can apply nitrogen at post-anthesis to try and get a protein bump. And so the idea was to see if we could do it in the middle and do it at boot to maybe get a little bit the best of both worlds, yield increase and protein increase. And the long story short of it, kind of what we found, when we combined all of the locations from 2016 through 2018, we got a significant protein bump by about 0.3, but overall there was no real differences in yield doing that base plus 30 system. And obviously, single environments are going to react differently. Some are not going to respond at all, and some might have a big yield bump just depending on what your individual environment is. But overall, we didn't see any benefit to doing that base plus 30 treatment. And if you guys have any questions about these, raise your hand and I can try and see if I can answer them.
Putting that in the spring or fall?
Okay, question.
Say that if you put the ESN in the fall, would that be a better test than putting all the? Some farmers put their ESN versus urea just alone.
Okay, so looking at different timings, fall versus spring and ESN and urea, and then maybe putting ESN in the fall versus urea spring, or both ESN and urea fall applied?
Yeah, versus fall versus spring, doing the same test. Fall versus spring, do you see a difference there?
Gotcha. So I'm trying to recall. I want to say that most of our plots were spring applied. Let's see, I was not with wheat for any of these trials, so I'm trying to remember. I might have to call on some of the growers maybe in the room who were here. I know there at least were a few fall applied fields and a lot of spring applied fields, and I think Tim Asowski was here, and I think he wants to say something.
Okay, yeah, Missy. So the question was, did we look back then at doing ESN in fall applied versus urea in the fall or urea in the spring? And we did not. So this data was directly all spring applied. So it was spring 100% ESN broadcast or spring 100% urea broadcast. That question did come up back then. We just never went that route. Yep.
both trials and then see if there was a difference that way.
Sure.
It'd be interesting to see that.
Absolutely. Yep. No, that could be another protocol to do. And that's, a lot of this is what do other people want to see? So, no, thank you for the feedback. I think that's something Missy can, discuss and see what other interest there is in doing that. I will say one big thing, it's still as critical now as it was back in 2012 when we started the first test, is nitrogen losses more than just the economics of it. We all know there's the environmental factor of it that's maybe even increasing more now. So even though some of these show non-significant, there is the other aspect to that, that if there's loss there, that's something that I think we, as the whole ag community, need to know to respond to other regulations and stuff. So I think there is more than just the data here that we're looking at. And you're right, there's different applications, timings can change the loss factor as well. So that could be something definitely we look into.
Yes, thank you, Tim, especially for that reminder. Yes, we tend to focus on, just the yield, just the protein, what are the economics of it, but yeah, there are those intangible things that we're just not good at measuring yet, like the environmental impacts, if we are losing nitrogen and how much we're losing. So that's a good point to bring up too. And yes, so this is the one, the protocol that we chose to look at. The difficulty and the drawback to on-farm trials being you're pretty much limited to 2 or 3 different treatments. And so yeah, if that's something that growers are interested and want to see, fall applied ESN versus urea, or maybe even fall ESN versus spring urea, if there is interest, we will definitely test it. So you guys just have to let us know what you want to do and what you want to see.
And I have something quick to add. So I work in the Carrington Research Center, and we've done trials with ESN for several years in wheat, where we applied it down the tube with the seed at planting, and found that we could apply it up to 90 pounds and get the same yield as if we had applied plain urea, worked in the soil as usual, even though we had some germination reduction, but then the yield made up for that difference. And this can be something useful for somebody who is no-tilling, if they can apply 90 pounds down the tube. And this was just the one location for several years in Carrington, so this might be something interesting to do on a different soil or elsewhere. And this was on wheat. We tried one time on corn, and that kind of maxed out at 30 pounds, so corn is a lot more susceptible. So.
Okay, yes, very good comments from, Carrington Research Station, I guess to summarize if you weren't able to catch it. So Carrington had looked at about up to 90 pounds of ESN down the tube with the wheat, with with the same yield as higher rates of urea. Yeah, so you can maybe gain a little bit more with the, I guess economically, with looking at the ESN. Okay, gotcha. So just maybe the advantage of being able to put that much down the tube safely if you're no-till, or if you're working on, reducing tillage, just having an extra option for a way to get your fertilizer down, which is becoming a more important topic of conversation, I think, too. So thank you for the comments. And if that's something people want to try, we can definitely try and work that out.
Was that under the irrigation or dry land out at Carrington?
We did both, and we did find that under irrigation, you can apply more safely than on dry land, but even on dry land, we got away with the 90 pounds. So, but no more than that. And that was on our soil, so it could be different on another soil.
He's wondering if it's sandy or clay soil.
Loam. Yeah.
Gotcha. Also good point. And also, thank you for the interaction and the conversation. You guys, if any of you have any comments or anything you'd like to add, this is definitely, doesn't have to be just a me presenting kind of meeting. It's definitely, would like to get, you guys are definitely more than welcome to kind of spark some conversations back and forth too.
One more comment, Missy. A little more background on back then when we decided the protocol of this trial that Missy's showing the data for, with kind of some of the limitations of this way of doing the trial, to add those other methods of applying it, we decided to just go with this spring applied 100% to the one product and 100% of the other. And I think it's just fair to say that this was, 4 years or 3 years in a 4-year time span of doing this method. But it's not to say that there is possibly other advantages to a polycoated urea in other application methods. So I think that's worth noting that this was all broadcast in the traditional spring applied method, but definitely fall applied, there's more time, more possibility of loss. And is that where the benefit of a polycoated or any of the nitrification inhibiting products or urease inhibiting products with fall applied, that's probably where they're going to benefit more. So that was not the protocol of this trial, but that could be of something we look at, because I think, as everybody knows, fall applied has a lot of advantages in our area, just breaking up the spring load, and I think there's definite advantages there. So it's what product to use. That's something we could look at more. It was just, this was what was decided back then, and that was how we got the funding to do it for 3 years, and that's.
A lot of fall applied fertilizer.
Yep.
The timing factor that you want to do it in the fall, that's probably the benefit of price get. So it sure be fun to see a test done that way. Fall.
Sure. Yep. And I think that's worth noting to say this trial is not saying that there is not any benefit to using a polycoated or any of the inhibiting products. That's not the conclusion of this trial. Yep.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I made it sound that way too. It's
No,
this is the data that, following this protocol, this is what we kind of found. But you're very much right, yes.
Yep, I think, Missy, over the years that has come up after we ended this trial was, this was all spring, and maybe there's the other thing with a polycoated in spring, you may not break it down quick enough to become available in time, especially for a wheat crop. So there's definitely the possibility of looking at this one again in some method or another.
Yes, and if you look down on your agenda at 11 o'clock, we are going to have a research needs discussion or a little bit of a research needs discussion, and so I will definitely take all of your guys' input about this trial or any others at that time too.
I'll catch one more question here. Was that, when you were no-tilling that in, was that with a single disc drill or a hoe drill for that nitrogen trial?
So we basically, one of the trials we compared putting agrotane on the surface or agrotane coated urea on the surface and putting ESN down the tube. And we also had one where we worked the urea in and applied the ESN down the tube. So we did this for several years in different combinations. So.
Do you recall what kind of equipment you used to do the seeding?
Oh yes, it was a single disc drill. Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions? Glad to see this one's a conversation starter. All right. With that, try to keep rolling through. So related to going on with the nitrogen. Oh yeah, we touched top dress already. Unless anybody wants to revisit top dressing. Touching seeding rates, we did a lot of work covering seeding rates on different varieties, and so we did seeding rate trials all the way from 2016 through last year in 2021. So you guys can hopefully read some of the different varieties that we did. So we originally started looking at 1.5, and 2 million live seeds per acre. And we looked at all the kind of current varieties that you guys were planting. So 9590, Valda, Lang in the short amount of time that folks were growing it. Bulls, Linkert, Shelley, and Torgy were all the varieties that we tested. And then after a few years, we actually switched to lowering our seeding rate treatments even further, since we really weren't seeing any differences between 1 million and 2 million plants per acre. So that's when we went to 3/4 million, 1.25, 1 3/4 million plants per acre. And this is a really small graph. I wish I had data to. I did not make this graph, so I didn't have the option to blow it up for you guys. But basically, to summarize it, kind of did an analysis to look at the optimal seeding rate by variety with the data that we had. And so with this graph, we can kind of see towards the middle, most of the varieties kind of centering around 1.4. I believe 1.3, 1.4 is the university recommendation for seeding rates. But some of the varieties like 9590 had about 9 locations of that actually. So 9590 ended up preferring a little bit higher seeding rate. So that one came out at about 1.8 million plants per acre was where that one was preferred. But still, most of them overall, the average centering right around that university rec of 1.4 million plants per acre. And so it's kind of our finding for that one. You probably can't read it online, but if you want to see this graph, it's also posted online at our website, or we have our print books from last year that we can get you also. So that was the yield optimal seeding rate, and then Kyle Jory, who's the one who did this analysis, he was also looking at the economically optimum seeding rates. So looking at seeding rates, what's your profitability as you're increasing seeding rate? And basically, kind of what he found with this is that as your market price is going up, it's more beneficial to increase your seeding rates. But when we've got low wheat prices, you're better off planting at a lower rate, since that extra seed is not going to make up in yield for the cost of that seed. So those were some of the main takeaways from our seeding rate trial. Kind of still, in general, that 1.4 per million plants per million being your optimal rate, but really, if you're seeding super high, it's definitely beneficial for you to lower those plants, because we really didn't see a lot of differences once the plants tillered out, and when it came to counting how many heads per acre there was really no differences between treatments when we were out there. So the plants really do compensate when you plant at those lower rates. Another thing that we did for a few years, this would have been 2018 through 2021 that we did this trial looking at flagleaf fungicide. So this would be kind of, I think the University of Minnesota terms it intensive management in their variety trial data. So this is looking at adding a third fungicide application into wheat, which is what everybody wants, is more time in the sprayer in the summer. So looking at your kind of what growers are doing is looking at a fungicide at tillering and your scab application at flowering, and then also adding a third treatment in there, which was comparing that to adding the 3 applications, tillering, flagleaf, and then flowering. And so when we looked at kind of all of our combined data from 2018 through 2020, what we found, and we did it, kind of broke it out by variety too. So we targeted varieties that were super susceptible to leaf diseases, and I'll try to compare them to varieties that are more tolerant to leaf diseases based on Jim Anderson's leaf disease rating tables that are in his variety selection guide. And so like Mayville, something that's super susceptible to leaf diseases, definitely benefited a lot from the flagleaf fungicides. That was almost a 4 bushel increase there, and then some of the other more tolerant varieties where we didn't expect to see much differences, we actually still did see yield bumps from the flag leaf application. So I think Valda being kind of our main one to look at that. So Valda still able to see kind of almost a 3 or 4 bushel increase with that flag leaf application. And then when we combined all of our data across looking at all varieties, so kind of the general picture, we were able to increase yield by a little over 2 bushels, almost 3 bushels with that third fungicide pass. So kind of economically, if the numbers are work out, you guys will have to kind of gauge that for yourselves. If 2.5, 3 bushels is going to cover your cost of application. We did this using Preaxer at Flagleaf, which is kind of a premium, top of the line, expensive fungicide. So we didn't look at using more of a generic or a cheaper fungicide, although you still want to be rotating your modes of action. But maybe using a generic would help your numbers work out a little bit better. But mostly we kind of saw, at least when we looked at it by variety, Valda was the only one that really paid for its yield response. Otherwise, it was kind of just breaking even. So that's obviously it's going to be seasonal dependent, variety dependent, and kind of what your costs are. You guys have any quick questions on that one? That one's pretty recent. So if you've been here in the last few years, you probably remember that data. Something that we did in the past was looking at plant growth regulators. So we did that from 2016 through 2018. Basically, is applying Palisade at the label rate after second node. So trying to really target right after you could detect that second node in jointing, trying to hit it with the plant growth regulator to maybe stunt it a little bit to, one, keep it from lodging. Years prior to that, we had a lot of lodging years, so that's kind of why this protocol got started. And then can we improve lodging and also increase yield, or maybe protein, never know, with the plant growth regulator. And I know some of the turf seed guys tend to do this more as a common practice because they definitely don't want the wheat lodging over onto their grass seed. So just looking at the data here, overall, we determined, looking at just all of our combined data, we did decrease plant height by about 1.3 inches with the growth regulator. Didn't really see any differences in yield. And unfortunately, the years that we did this, the sites that we did this, we didn't really have a lot of lodging. So that was kind of just the unfortunate part of doing the test, is trying to test something that's supposed to help with lodging, and then we didn't get lodging in the test plots. So I think that's but that's the data that we have for when we looked at plant growth regulators. Did we check for an increase in stem diameter? No, we did not. That I think we left to maybe some of the small plot researchers, small plot data, just because that can be so variable across the length of the field. Trying to sample for that in a large plot would be difficult.
If you're able to drop the height of that plant, you can increase cell stem diameter, if that would help with soft lie damage as well too.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that is an interesting comment. Okay. If you use a plant growth regulator and increase stem diameter to decrease your damage from soft lie? Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So Craig is wondering if increasing your stem diameter and the thickness of that stem would mitigate your damage from sawfly. That is a good question. I do not have the answer to that one. Might be a Yoakum question. All right, we'll just touch on one more trial here before the break. So a trial that we did, a tillage trial that we did for 3 years from 2017 to 2019. So this was looking at vertical tillage compared to conventional tillage, just at one site, over one farm over 3 years in a wheat soybean rotation. And so basically the treatment was fall, looking at a sulfured vertical tillage implement and comparing that to chisel plow and cultivating as kind of the conventional treatment. And I think I have it kind of simplified there on the screen. It was either 1 or 2 vertical tillage passes depending on the year, just in what the crop needed, and then compared to the fall chisel plow pass followed by a cultivator pass. And so overall, what we found was that yield was not different between the 2 treatments, which was good. We reduced tillage, reduced the effect, destruction on the soil properties that the chisel plow and cultivator were doing, and we didn't lose any yield because of it. So that was good. That was what we wanted to see. We looked at soil temp, and I apologize for these graphs. I put this on here, and I'm like, this is a terrible graph. Who made this graph? I did. I made a terrible graph. But basically, this graph is showing the kind of line in the center there is the control, and then the vertical tillage is where the dots are where the vertical tillage fell. And so one year we actually had a significant difference where the vertical tillage soil was actually warmer than the conventional tilled soil. But not too big a differences in soil temperature there. It's just varying by a few degrees. And then soil moisture differences, still kind of not too much, still kind of those dots really are only 1 or 2 percentage points varying around that control. So not a whole lot of meaningful difference in soil moisture between the vertical tillage versus the conventional tillage also. I know somebody is probably wondering about compaction differences in the vertical till versus conventional. We did collect some penetrometer readings. We attempted to collect some penetrometer readings, but the data just wasn't that great, which is unfortunate because I think that would be really meaningful and add to the story here. So I just couldn't really put the penetrometer data together. So that's kind of a summary of the vertical tillage trial that we did. I think I get a lot of questions about tillage, and when we get to kind of the research needs discussion, if you guys have questions about tillage, I think that would be a good thing to bring up in future research, because there's so many different kinds of tillage and so many options and things to do. I know guys are wondering about what they should be doing or not doing, and so if there's interest in people who want to test different tillage methods or different equipment, I think that's something we should definitely be working on in the future. So that was a little review about where we are, where we've been, and now where we are going. So before the break here, just to touch on our 2023 research trials. So there's been a lot of talk about biologicals. That's becoming pretty popular. And so I have a question mark on there, but I'm still talking with the Pivot Bio rep. So we just as to test a commercial biological product that's available to you guys. We'll hopefully maybe be testing out Pivot Bio on wheat next year. We've also submitted a grant to look at a Johnson Sioux bioreactor, for those of you who know what that is. That's kind of, I guess, making your own biologicals at home, to sum it up. And I know that kind of sounds a little crazy, but once you start learning about it, it's actually pretty cool. So there's just a few specific growers that really wanted to test that out. So we're going to be working on them with that, hopefully, if our grant gets funded. And then those are our kind of 2 main new ones that we'll be looking at next year, and then we'll be repeating everything that we did this year. We'll be repeating next year and probably the year after that to really get a few different growing seasons under our belts for those. So foliar copper applications, I'll definitely be looking for sites for those. Polyhalite versus AMS, nitrogen rates on different varieties. Rock rolling wheat, getting some more sites on that, and then looking at rye cover crop termination, which is a trial that we'll hear more about coming up after the break. Also, volunteer wheat as a cover crop. The value of volunteer, just leaving your volunteer wheat out there to grow, to leave your soil covered versus controlling it or tilling it, or trying to plant another cover crop that may or may not germinate. And then also continued research with a plot that we're doing with long-term rotation with and without cover crops. So we've got a lot of different options for people to try, and we can always add some more in there if there's interest, or if we are going in one direction, but you guys say we need to go in a different direction, we can do that. But we just need to get your feedback to determine where your research dollars really are going to go.